whenever I'm invited to speak to a group like this about this issue, I feel like
Mike.
I feel like I've been invited to give the eulogy for a very great person who's died, and I'm honored to have been asked, but I'm saddened by the occasion. This is a sad and pressing problem facing universities because it not only implies that there's something defective about the system that doesn't protect Jews from being harassed or oppressed or libeled, but it's a disintegration of the values of higher education itself, which is a more broad problem that all of society should care about. The great commentator and journalist Melanie Phillips from Britain just wrote a book, which some of you may be familiar with. It's called The World Turned Upside Down. And it's a study, a very caustic and cynical study of how Western values and Western society have been toppled and have given in to the forces of Islam and third world ideologies which seek to destroy the very values upon which our Western societies have been built. She calls it the dialogue of the demented, this idea that the conversations and narratives that we're having about Islam, the West, about the Middle East, the Arab-Palestinian conflict, are inversions of the truth. They're false narratives. They turn history on its head. They create a view of the world which is cast through ideological eyes and is therefore false and dangerous. It's dangerous for the continuation of our society. And writing from Britain, as Melanie Phillips does, where the entire culture of Britain is giving way to the forces of Islam, she sees a suicide going on there, which James Burnham wrote about long ago, called The Suicide of the West, where giving up these values that are important leads us to the destruction of our own institutions and institutions of learning. This world turned upside down has no better laboratory and no better example than the campuses today, as you've seen a small portion of. I spent the last 4 years studying the instances of anti-Israelism and what has morphed into and regularly becomes raw anti-Semitism on campuses. It's very convenient, as you know, for folks who probably at heart may be anti-Semites to say, oh, no, 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 I have no issues with Jews. It's only those disgusting Nazi-like Zionist Israelis that I despise, and they're ruining the earth, and they're the sole impediment to world peace. So why did this happen on campuses? What's going on that's letting this come about? There's a lot of factors going on. One of them is this phenomenon that the journalist David Horowitz characterized as an unholy alliance, he called it. And what he meant was that two groups on campuses particularly have joined forces against a common enemy of Israel. And that is the Muslim student groups and those supporters in the Islamic world and in America and in the West in general, who support the ideals, ideologies, and objectives of the Muslim students, and the, by and large, liberal factions of faculty members and students on campuses. The quote that Avi mentioned about the greatest crime of the 20th century being racism was by Irwin Cotler, who's a member of Parliament in Canada. Great humanitarian, a sweet, soft-spoken man, but he has very high virtues. And he made an interesting observation. He said that in the 20th century, the greatest crime was racism. And where was that crime most centered, and where was it coalesced to its greatest degree? In Nazism and in apartheid. Well, who regularly and promiscuously today is accused of being an apartheid nation and a Nazi-like nation? Israel. This perversion of the Holocaust, the minimizing of the actual Holocaust, the ascribing to Israelis and Jews of becoming Nazis themselves, is not only cruel and slanderous, it's almost demonic in a moral way to make that kind of ascription to Israelis as becoming the new Nazis, which you saw on many of the posters and flyers for university-sponsored events. The politics of genocide, Israel, from Auschwitz to Gaza. Imagine comparing Auschwitz with Gaza. You hear Gaza referred to by the enemies of Israel continuously on campus as the world's largest outdoor prison. Well, what it actually has become is the world's largest staging ground for 8,000 missiles that have flown into Israel since 2005, when Israel disengaged. An inversion of history. The world turned upside down, where the aggressor is the victim. The other phenomenon on campus is that the Palestinians, not because they're actually loved, not because they're supporters, as Avi mentioned, actually care about whether they have statehood or not. As far as the Arab world is concerned, they can languish in refugee camps for eternity, because there's no greater way to show how evil Israel is than to have those 4.5 million refugees sitting in refugee camps stateless, even though they've been offered a state in 1937, in 1947, in 1967, in 2000. They could have had a state in any one of those times. They're still in refugee camps because they are an instrument of propaganda against Israel. There's no better way to make Israel look like a pariah state than by having the existence of a stateless Palestinian group of refugees. This is a narrative that's promoted on campus, but it's promoted not as if it's the fault of the Palestinians, obviously. It's Israel's fault for being intransigent, or for having 1,300 apartments being built in East Jerusalem, in a Jewish neighborhood, in the capital of Israel. And Joseph Biden is going to Israel complaining that Jews are living in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, an Arab will get the death penalty for selling land to a Jew. This is the world turned upside down, where Muslim student groups regularly and promiscuously have week-long hate Israel events with speakers coming from outside of the university who demonize, delegitimize, slander, and lie about the true state of Israel and the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. There's 600 chapters of the Muslim Student Associations on American campuses. They are largely responsible for generating publicity against Israel. And as you see from the brief excerpts that we've seen, the bulk of their agitation is not towards statehood for Palestine, for the Palestinians. It's to demonize Israel. That's the chief objective. This idea of the other side seeking a Palestinian state and an Israeli state living side by side in peace, that's a fantasy. No one on the other side cares about that. They want a state without Israel being there. And it's clear that all of their ideologies, all of their approach to the politics of Israel is to make Israel be destroyed. Thus, the boycotts, divestment, and sanction movements on campus. Campus leaders are at the forefront of the boycott movement, trying to get universities to divest, to destroy Israel by weakening it economically, by depriving it of weaponry by which it can defend itself. Well, it's very interesting, but last month, one of the leaders of the boycott movement said, you know what? It doesn't even matter if any university actually ever divests and pulls money out of Israel. Why doesn't it matter? Because what matters is that they can constantly refer to Israel as an apartheid nation over and over again and call for divestment. Whether the divestment happens or not is almost irrelevant. What's relevant is that they're able to continually lie about the character of Israel, that Israel is a racist apartheid nation, that it's somehow depriving the Palestinians of statehood, that Israel is the fault in the Middle East, that Israel is the main impediment to world peace, that Israelis are Nazi-like. This is the narrative that students walking by these regular demonstrations hear over and over again. So after 4 years at a university, when most students go in to college with little or no political feelings either way, liberal or conservative, maybe some passing interest in Israel, many students leave college now thinking that Israel is the worst country on earth, that they are barbaric, they're Nazi-like, they deprive the Palestinians of a state. And the Palestinians have become the new South Africans now. They're the favorite victim of the left. So that the same folks that were behind the unraveling of apartheid in South Africa have now taken up the Palestinian cause as their own. The third world victim, the powerless rock-throwing Palestinian child who faces the Apache helicopters of Israel, the military might of this mighty, militaristic, imperialistic, colonial power, the Zionist regime of Israel, against these poor, innocent Palestinians whose land was stolen by colonists who came from Europe to the Promised Land with no prior connection to the Holy Land. This is the narrative. This is what's taught in Middle East departments at Columbia and elsewhere. That all of the pathologies of Arab states and those totalitarian regimes and those dysfunctional societies are because of imperialism, the legacy of colonialism, and the existence of a democracy, a Jewish democracy in the midst. So this narrative on campuses, this agitation that's promulgated by left-leaning professors, radical Muslim and other students, self-hating Jewish groups and students like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Americans Knew, all of these forces come together with a common enemy, and that enemy is Israel.